The announcement came during morning roll call at the women's POW camp in Somerset, on a surprisingly warm day in October 1945, delivered by Colonel Chambers through her usual interpreter in the matter-of-fact tone she used for all administrative communications. Stay with me to the end, and if you want more real World War II stories like this, please like the video, subscribe, and support the channel so we can keep bringing you these powerful histories. The approximately 80 German women prisoners assembled in the camp yard listened with their typical mixture of attention and wariness as the commandant explained that British authorities had decided to establish craft workshops in the camp, that materials and tools would be provided for prisoners who wished to engage in various handicraft activities during their free time, and that the products of this work could be kept by the prisoners themselves or sold through a system that would be explained later. The women's initial reaction was not enthusiasm or gratitude, but rather profound confusion, expressed in the muttered conversations that rippled through the assembled prisoners even before the interpreter had finished translating. "Why are they giving us tools?" one woman asked her neighbour. "What's the catch?" another wondered aloud. "Is this some kind of test?" a third speculated, her voice carrying the suspicion that had become second nature during months of captivity. The confusion was understandable, given everything the women had learned about what being a prisoner of war typically meant. They had spent months in British custody, initially in temporary facilities and then in this permanent camp. And while their treatment had been generally humane and consistent with Geneva Convention requirements, it had also been fundamentally about restriction and control. They were told where to sleep, when to wake, what work to perform, where they could and couldn't go. The concept of being provided with materials and tools to pursue their own projects during their own time seemed to violate basic assumptions about what captivity meant, seemed to suggest a level of autonomy and trust that made no sense in the context of enemy prisoners being held against their will. Several women immediately suspected this was a trick, that the tools would be withdrawn, or that prisoners who used them would somehow be punished or exploited, that British authorities must have some hidden motive that wasn't immediately apparent. And the craft shed itself was a wooden structure that had been hastily erected near the camp's administrative buildings, equipped with basic workbenches, adequate lighting from windows and electric fixtures, and storage for materials and tools. When prisoners were first allowed to enter the shed in small supervised groups to see what was available, they found supplies that suggested British authorities had put genuine thought and resources into the project: fabric and thread for sewing, yarn for knitting, wood and basic carpentry tools, materials for basket weaving, clay for pottery, paper and pencils for drawing. A British sergeant who supervised the shed explained through an interpreter that prisoners could sign up for scheduled times to use the facilities, that they would be taught basic skills if needed, and that they could work on whatever projects interested them within reasonable limits, and that finished products would belong to the prisoners who made them. The first women to actually use the craft shed did so with extreme caution, treating the tools and materials as if they might suddenly be snatched away, working quickly to complete projects before the inevitable withdrawal of privileges occurred. One woman, a former secretary named Helga Werner, later recalled spending her first session in the shed making a simple cloth bag, working with frantic intensity to finish it before the guards told her to stop, only to realize after 2 hours that no one was going to interrupt her or take away her materials. The psychological adjustment required to accept that this privilege was real and would continue took weeks for most prisoners, a gradual process of testing boundaries and discovering that the stated rules were actually being enforced as stated. What the British authorities understood, though they rarely articulated it explicitly, was that the craft program served multiple practical purposes beyond simple humanitarian concern for prisoners' well-being. Bored prisoners with too much unstructured time became restless and difficult to manage, created discipline problems, sank into depression that affected camp morale, and increased demands on medical resources. Providing constructive activities reduced these problems while also giving prisoners skills that might be useful when they eventually returned to Germany's shattered economy. And the cost of materials and tools was minimal compared to the administrative burden of managing a population with nothing to occupy their time and attention. From a purely pragmatic management perspective, the craft program made sense, even without considering humanitarian motivations. But the program also reflected something more complex about British attitudes toward German prisoners by late 1945, a recognition that these women were not Nazi ideologues or war criminals, but rather ordinary people who had been caught up in their nation's disaster and who now needed to be managed humanely while awaiting repatriation that might take months or years. The decision to provide tools, objects that could theoretically be used as weapons or for escape attempts, represented a calculated judgment that the women posed minimal security threat and that treating them with some level of trust was more effective than maintaining maximum restrictions. This judgment reflected both British confidence in their security measures and a broader policy approach that emphasised preparing German prisoners for eventual return to civilian life rather than simply warehousing them until repatriation became possible. The women's use of the craft shed evolved in interesting ways as they gradually accepted that the privilege was genuine and would continue. Initial projects tended to be practical, mending worn clothing, making simple items for personal use, creating things that addressed immediate needs. But as confidence grew and as women realized they could work on whatever interested them, the projects became more ambitious and more personally expressive. Some women began creating decorative items, working on needlework or wood carvings that served no practical purpose beyond being beautiful or meaningful. Others used the craft shed as a way to process their experiences, creating works that reflected their emotions about the war, their captivity, their uncertain futures. A few women with artistic backgrounds before the war found in the craft shed a space to reconnect with creative practices they had abandoned during the conflict. The social dynamics around the craft shed became as important as the physical work being done there. Women who had particular skills, an experienced seamstress, and a woman who had worked in furniture manufacturing, someone with training in decorative arts, found themselves teaching others, creating informal apprenticeship relationships that gave both teacher and student a sense of purpose and connection. The craft shed became a space where normal social hierarchies could emerge based on skill and knowledge rather than on the arbitrary status of being prisoners. Women who excelled at crafts gained respect and recognition from their peers, creating positive social dynamics that contrasted with the often depressing atmosphere of camp life outside the shed. The question of what to do with finished products created interesting complications that British authorities hadn't fully anticipated. Some women kept their creations, decorating their barracks or holding on to items as reminders of their captivity or as gifts they intended to bring home to family when repatriation finally occurred. But others wanted to sell or trade their work, creating an informal economy within the camp that British authorities had to decide whether to encourage, regulate, or suppress. The solution that emerged was a compromise. Prisoners could sell their crafts through a system managed by camp authorities, with proceeds going into accounts that prisoners could access for purchases at the camp canteen or that would be given to them upon repatriation. This system acknowledged prisoners' desire for some economic autonomy while maintaining British control over financial transactions. The permission to sell crafts created unexpected connections between prisoners and the local British community. Camp authorities arranged for some prisoner-made items to be sold at local markets and charity events, with British civilians purchasing handicrafts made by German prisoners without necessarily knowing or caring about their origin. A hand-knitted scarf or a carved wooden box was simply a well-made item at a reasonable price, valuable in Britain's still rationing economy where consumer goods remained scarce. These transactions represented a kind of normalization of relations between former enemies, commercial exchanges that treated German prisoners as producers of value rather than simply as defeated enemies to be managed. Not all prisoners participated in the craft program or viewed it positively, and some maintained that accepting British materials and making things under British supervision was a form of collaboration, that prisoners should maintain strict separation from their captors rather than engaging in activities that suggested cooperation or normalization of their situation. A few women argued that the craft program was manipulation, a way for British authorities to extract labour while making prisoners feel grateful for the privilege of working. These critics pointed out that prisoners' time and skills were being used to produce items that British civilians would purchase, creating value that the prisoners themselves saw little benefit from beyond the psychological satisfaction of having something to do. Others simply had no interest in crafts, finding the activities offered in the shed uninteresting, or feeling that their time was better spent on other pursuits: reading, learning English, writing letters, or simply resting after work details. The craft program was voluntary, and British authorities generally didn't pressure prisoners to participate, recognizing that forcing involvement would undermine whatever positive effects the program was meant to achieve. The result was that perhaps half the camp's population used the craft shed regularly, another quarter participated occasionally, and the remainder never engaged with the program at all. The craft shed also became a space where prisoners could partially escape the constant awareness of being monitored and controlled that characterized camp life. While guards supervised the shed and were present during all activities, the nature of craft work, focused, absorbing, requiring concentration on the task at hand, allowed prisoners to lose themselves in their projects in a way that felt almost like being free. Several women described the craft shed as the only place in camp where they could forget, even temporarily, that they were prisoners, where the focus on creating something allowed them to exist as craftspeople rather than as enemy nationals being held in custody. The psychological benefits of creative work became increasingly apparent to both prisoners and camp authorities as the program continued. Women who regularly used the craft shed showed better morale, fewer symptoms of depression, better cooperation with camp rules, and generally more positive attitudes toward their situation. British medical staff noted that prisoners involved in crafts required less treatment for stress-related conditions and seemed better able to cope with the uncertainty and powerlessness that characterized their status. These observations reinforced British commitment to the program and led to gradual expansion of available materials and tools as authorities recognized the craft shed's value as a management tool. The question of why are they giving us tools gradually transformed from suspicious confusion to a more complex understanding of how captivity was being managed and what British authorities hoped to achieve. The women came to recognize that the craft program served British interests, keeping prisoners occupied and manageable, while also providing genuine benefits to prisoners themselves. And this dual nature made the program both more and less troubling than simple generosity would have been. It was clearly instrumental rather than purely humanitarian, yet the instrumental purposes aligned well enough with prisoners' interests that most came to view the program as a positive aspect of their captivity, even while recognizing its management functions. For some prisoners, engagement with crafts became a way to maintain dignity and sense of self during the degrading experience of captivity. Being able to create something beautiful or useful, to exercise skill and judgment, to produce work that others valued, these experiences provided affirmation of worth and capability that captivity otherwise systematically denied. The craft shed offered a space where prisoners could be more than just bodies to be fed and housed, where they could express individuality and competence in ways the general camp regime didn't permit. The legacy of the craft program extended beyond the immediate benefits during captivity. When prisoners were eventually repatriated to Germany throughout 1946 and 1947, many carried with them skills learned or refined in the British craft shed. In Germany's destroyed economy, where traditional employment was scarce, these craft skills sometimes provided ways to earn income or trade for necessities. Several women who had learned woodworking or sewing in the Somerset craft shed later established small businesses using those skills. Whether they ever acknowledged to customers or family that they had learned these trades while imprisoned in Britain is unknown, but the connection between British captivity and post-war survival strategies existed nonetheless. The tools themselves, the needles, scissors, carving knives, saws, and other implements that had seemed so puzzling when first offered, became symbols of a particular approach to managing defeated enemies. An approach that combined control with cultivation, that sought to prepare prisoners for eventual return to civilian life, rather than simply warehousing them until that return became possible. The question, why are they giving us tools, had multiple answers, because it made camp management easier, because it served humanitarian purposes, because it aligned with British self-image as civilized victors, because it made economic sense, because individual British personnel genuinely cared about prisoners' well-being. All these motivations coexisted, making the craft program simultaneously calculated and compassionate, instrumental and humane, a reflection of the complex realities of how victors treated the defeated in the aftermath of history's most destructive war.